If you had told me 6 months ago that I'd wake up to find my entire western field surrounded by an 8-foot privacy fence with community green space signs plastered all over it, I would have thought you were crazy. But that's exactly what happened on a crisp autumn morning at Willow Creek Farm. And let me tell you, what followed was a battle that would test not just my patience, but everything my family had built over 4 generations. Before I dive into this crazy story, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. Growing up on Willow Creek Farm, I learned early that land isn't just something you own, it's something you live. My name's Jack Anderson, and this story isn't just about a fence or an HOA overstepping its bounds. It's about fighting for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Every morning for the past 25 years, I've walked the same path my great-grandfather George Anderson carved out in 1932. Back then, this wasn't the fertile farmland you see today. It was nothing but rocky soil and wild grass that nobody thought would amount to much. But George, fresh off the boat from Ireland with nothing but determination and a handful of seeds, saw potential where others saw wasteland. The western field, the one that would later become the center of this whole mess, that was where it all started. Great-grandpa George spent 3 years just clearing the rocks, piling them one by one to build the stone wall that still partly stands today. My grandfather Bill used to tell me how George would work from sunrise to sunset, stopping only to eat the simple lunch my great-grandmother would bring him. Brown bread and cheese, sometimes an apple if times were good. I remember sitting on our worn wooden porch as a kid, listening to Grandpa Bill's stories about those early days. He'd point to different parts of the farm, each spot holding a piece of our family's history. See that old oak by the creek, Jack? Your great-grandpa planted that the day your grandma was born. And that barn, we raised that in '62. Whole community came together. Took us just 3 days. The barn still stands proud, its red paint faded, but its foundation as solid as the day it was built. Inside, the wooden beams still bear the initials of the men who helped raise it, including my grandfather's W.A. carved next to the date. Every nail, every board, every stone in our walls tells a story of hard work and perseverance. Emma, my wife, jokes that I can't walk 10 feet on this farm without stopping to tell a story about something that happened there. She's right, of course. There's the spot where I taught Lily, our daughter, to ride her first horse, an old gentle mare named Daisy. The apple orchard, where Noah, our son, spent countless summer afternoons helping me repair the irrigation systems, learning the importance of maintenance and care, just like I had from my father. The western field has always been special, though. It's our most fertile plot, where we grow the organic vegetables that supply half of Riverside Valley's farmers. Market. The rich, dark soil there has fed our family and community for generations. My father used to say you could drop a penny in that soil and it'd grow into a dollar tree. He wasn't far wrong. The carrots and tomatoes we grow there have won the Green Creek County Fair Blue Ribbon 6 years running. Ray Martinez, our neighbor to the north, always says our western field grows the sweetest corn he's ever tasted. It's that creek water, he'd say, referring to the natural spring that runs along the property line. You can't bottle magic like that. Ray's been farming alongside us for 30 years, and like most folks around here, he understands that farming isn't just a job, it's a way of life. That's why what happened next hit so hard. It wasn't just about the fence they put up or the ridiculous community green space signs. It was about something deeper, a threat to a legacy that's been growing in this soil for nearly a century. The first sign of trouble came when Oak Ridge Estates started developing the old Miller property to the west of us. Nobody thought much of it at first. Progress is inevitable after all. But then the letters started coming, and with them, a woman named Victoria Palmer entered our lives, bringing a storm that would shake our family's foundation to its core. Before I tell you about how things went wrong with Oak Ridge Estates, you need to understand what makes Riverside Valley special. This isn't just a collection of farms and families. It's a tapestry of lives woven together over generations. Take the Thompsons, Steve and Marie, who run the dairy farm next door. Every morning at dawn, I'd hear their old truck rumbling down the dirt road, and like clockwork, Steve would stop by our fence line. "Morning, Jack," he'd call out, thermos in hand. "Emma made extra coffee?" It became such a routine that Emma started brewing an extra pot before sunrise, knowing Steve would appear just as the morning fog was lifting off the fields. The Reeds, Robert and Jenny, managed the largest dairy operation in the county just down the road. Their son went to school with our Lily, and now they're both on the county's 4-H council together. When our combine broke down during last year's harvest, Robert didn't hesitate. He drove his over after finishing his own fields, working well into the night to help us bring in the crop before the rain hit. Grace Sullivan, who's lived here longer than anyone else, runs the local farming association. Her porch has been our unofficial community center for decades. Every Sunday after church, folks would gather there, sharing news, trading advice, and solving problems over her famous apple pie. "Communities are built on front porches," she always says, "not in city halls." I remember one particularly tough season when drought hit the valley hard. Frank Wilson, our elderly farming mentor who's forgotten more about agriculture than most people will ever know, called an emergency meeting at Grace's place. Instead of everyone fending for themselves, we developed a water sharing system. Those of us with access to the creek helped those without. We survived that summer because we worked together. Joe Baker, who runs the general store in town, started keeping a tab system during that drought. "Pay when the rain comes," he'd say, knowing every farmer in the valley would make good on their debts. And we did. Every single one of us. Because that's how things work here. Trust isn't just given, it's earned through generations of keeping your word. Our local vet, Dr. Amanda White, goes above and beyond what you'd expect. When our best dairy cow had complications during calving at 2 a.m. last winter, she didn't just phone in advice. She drove through a snowstorm to help, stayed until dawn, and then refused to take payment, saying, "Just bring me some of those famous Anderson tomatoes come summer." That's the kind of community we've built here. Tim Richards at the feed store keeps track of everyone's schedules and needs. He'll call out of the blue saying, "Jack, your order of alfalfa usually comes in next week, but I'm hearing about shortages. Want me to set aside extra from this shipment?" That kind of thoughtfulness, that attention to detail and care for your neighbors, you can't put a price on that. Even Mark Reynolds, who supplies most of our equipment, understands the rhythm of farm life. He keeps spare parts for our older machines, knowing we prefer to repair than replace. "Farming's in the blood," he always says, "and so is taking care of your own. When my old tractor needed a part, they don't make anymore. Mark spent weeks tracking one down through his network of suppliers. The local police department, especially Officer Sarah Mitchell, has always understood our way of life. She grew up on a farm herself and knows that sometimes we need to move equipment at odd hours or have unusual traffic during harvest season. She works with us, not against us, making sure everyone stays safe while respecting our agricultural needs. Jim Brooks at the hardware store is another pillar of our community. His shop isn't just a place to buy tools, it's where solutions are found. He keeps a bulletin board where farmers post what they need or have to share. Extra hay, used equipment or labor during busy seasons. I've seen him stay open late countless times when someone had an emergency repair, saying, "Can't let a neighbor's fence stay down overnight." Our county commissioner, David Harrison, comes from a farming background himself. He's been crucial in maintaining the agricultural character of our valley, fighting against overdevelopment while understanding that some change is inevitable. "It's about balance," he always says at town meetings, "preserving our heritage while planning for the future." Dr. Lisa Chen, our local environmental expert, has been instrumental in helping us maintain sustainable farming practices. She's worked with every farm in the valley to develop water conservation methods and soil management techniques that have actually improved our yields while protecting the land for future generations. But perhaps the most important relationship in our farming community is with Ray Martinez. Ray's more than just a neighbor. He's family in all but name. When Emma was in the hospital having Noah, Ray and his wife handled our entire harvest. They refused any payment, saying, "Family takes care of family." That's just how things are done here. The Martinez and Anderson families have shared more than just property lines over the years. Our children grew up together, learned to drive. Tractors together, showed animals at the same county fairs.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Ray's expertise in irrigation has saved our crops more than once, and our mechanical skills have kept his equipment running through many harvests. This web of relationships, these unwritten agreements and understood obligations, they're what make our communities strong. We don't need written contracts or formal arrangements. A handshake means something here. When someone's barn needs painting, we all show up with brushes. When a family faces hardship, casseroles appear on their porch without anyone taking credit. That's why what Oak Ridge Estates did wasn't just an attack on my farm. It was an assault on our entire way of life. They didn't understand that by fencing off that field, they weren't just taking land. They were trying to break connections that had been strengthening for generations. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The important thing to understand is that when the HOA made their move, they weren't just taking on one farmer. They were challenging an entire community. And they were about to learn that in Riverside Valley, we take care of our own. The first signs of change in Riverside Valley came so subtly that most of us barely noticed. It started with the surveyors. They appeared one morning on the old Miller property, their bright yellow equipment standing out against the fading autumn colors. None of us thought much of it at first. Land gets surveyed all the time, and Old Man Miller had passed away the previous spring with no heirs interested in farming. I remember the morning I first noticed something was different. I was checking the irrigation lines in the western field when I heard the unfamiliar sound of luxury cars driving down our dusty road. 3 black SUVs, so clean they looked out of place among our mud-splattered farm trucks, pulled up to the Miller property. Men in suits stepped out, pointing at various spots across the land, their leather shoes getting coated in our rich valley soil. Ray Martinez called me that evening. "Jack, you see those city folks today?" His voice carried that hint of concern we farmers get when something threatens to disrupt our seasonal rhythms. Heard from Tim at the feed store. They're from some development company. Oak Ridge something. The news spread through our community like wildfire. Grace Sullivan called an informal meeting at her place that weekend. Her living room was packed. The Thompsons, the Reeds, Ray and his family, even Frank Wilson made it out despite his bad hip. The conversation centered around one question: what would this mean for our valley? David Harrison, our county commissioner, tried to reassure us. "It's just another housing development," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "They'll have to follow all the usual zoning regulations." What none of us knew then was that Oak Ridge Estates had already begun laying the groundwork for something much bigger than a simple housing development. The changes accelerated after that. Construction equipment began arriving, huge machines that dwarfed even our largest tractors. The peaceful morning chorus of birdsong was replaced by the constant beeping of backing vehicles and the roar of earth movers. The dust from their work would drift across our fields, coating our crops in a fine layer of grit. Dr. Lisa Chen, our environmental expert, was the first to raise concrete concerns. She stopped by one afternoon, her usual calm demeanor disturbed. "Jack, their runoff is going to affect your water supply," she explained, showing me satellite maps on her tablet. The way they're grading the land, all the surface water will flow right into your western field. Have they contacted you about water management? They hadn't, of course. In fact, nobody from Oak Ridge Estates had bothered to reach out to any of us neighboring farmers. That should have been our first warning sign. In our community, major changes were always discussed. Neighbors consulted, concerns addressed. But these developers operated differently. The first official communication came in the form of a glossy brochure in our mailboxes. "Welcome to the future of Riverside Valley," it proclaimed in elegant script over photos of perfectly manicured lawns and colonial-style houses. Inside was a notice about the formation of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, along with a map that made my blood run cold. According to their plans, the development wouldn't just stay on the Miller property. The map showed future phases, extending into what they called green belt zones, including a significant portion of my western field. They'd marked it as community green space, as if they already owned it. I took the brochure to Mike Cooper, our family lawyer. He studied it carefully, his frown deepening as he read. "This is concerning, Jack," he said, pulling out his reading glasses to examine the fine print. "They're using some creative zoning language here. We need to watch this carefully." The impact on our daily lives grew more noticeable. New traffic appeared on our once quiet roads, with construction vehicles starting earlier and running later than any farmer would. The dust became so bad that Jenny Reed had to bring her sensitive dairy cows in from their usual pasture. The new runoff patterns Dr. Chen had warned about began affecting our irrigation systems. Officer Sarah Mitchell started getting calls about our farm equipment blocking the road during harvest time, something that had never been an issue before. "I'm doing my best to explain agricultural right-of-way laws," she told me, clearly frustrated. "But these new folks don't seem to understand that farms were here first." Even Joe Baker at the general store felt the shift. "Had someone complain about the tractor parking in front of the store," he told me one morning, "said it was unsightly and bad for property values. Can you believe that? That spot's been tractor parking since my grandfather opened this place." The tension reached a new level when they started putting up their model homes. These weren't just houses. They were mansions with perfectly manicured lawns and fancy water features that seemed to mock our irrigation ponds. The construction crews worked through weekends, ignoring the unwritten rule about Sundays being a day of rest in our valley. But the real wake-up call came during the County Planning Commission meeting. Grace Sullivan attended, as she always did, and called me immediately after. "Jack, they're not just building houses," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "They're trying to rezone everything within a mile of their development. They want to set up some kind of agricultural aesthetic overlay district, whatever that means." It meant trouble, as we soon found out. The overlay district would give their HOA input on how we managed our farms, all in the name of maintaining community standards. They wanted to regulate everything from the height of our corn to the color we painted our barns. Frank Wilson, who'd seen more changes in the valley than any of us, summed it up best. "They don't want real farms," he said during one of our community meetings. "They want hobby farms and petting zoos. They want to play at being rural without understanding what that really means." I remember standing in my western field that evening after everyone had gone home, watching the sun set behind the half-built houses of Oak Ridge Estates. The same field where my great-grandfather had cleared rocks by hand, where my grandfather had taught me to plow straight furrows, where my own children had learned to drive a tractor. The thought of someone else controlling this land, of HOA rules dictating how we could farm it, made my stomach churn. What none of us knew then was that this was just the beginning. The glossy brochures and planning commission meetings were just the opening moves in a battle that would test our community's strength like never before. Victoria Palmer and her HOA were about to show their true colors, and when they did, they'd learn exactly what it means to go up against a farming community that stood together for generations. It was a Tuesday morning when I first met Victoria Palmer. I'd been up since dawn, fixing a broken fence post in the western field, the same field that would soon become the center of our conflict. The October air was crisp, and the morning dew still clung to the grass when I heard the distinct sound of heels clicking on our gravel driveway. I turned to see a woman who looked completely out of place on a working farm. Victoria Palmer wore a tailored navy business suit that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the morning breeze. She carried a leather portfolio in one hand and what looked like some kind of designer coffee cup in the other. "Mr. Anderson." Her voice carried that particular tone of forced pleasantness that sets your teeth on edge. "I'm Victoria Palmer, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I was hoping we could have a chat about your operation here." The way she said operation, like she was referring to some kind of questionable business rather than a century-old family farm, told me everything I needed to know about her perspective. Still, my mother raised me with manners, so I pulled off my work gloves and extended my hand. "Jack Anderson," I said. "Welcome to Willow Creek Farm." She looked at my dirt-covered hand for a moment before giving it the quickest possible shake. "Yes, well, I've been reviewing some documents about your property, and there seem to be some matters we need to discuss." She opened her portfolio, pulling out a stack of papers with colored tabs. "Our development committee has been analyzing the aesthetic impact of surrounding properties on Oak Ridge Estates," she continued, her voice taking on a rehearsed quality. "We've identified several areas of concern regarding your western field, specifically." I remember thinking how surreal this moment felt. Here was this woman, standing in the same spot where my family had worked the land for 4 generations, telling me there were concerns about our farm. Behind her, I could see Ray Martinez in his field, pretending to check his irrigation, but obviously watching the interaction with concern. "Ms. Palmer," I started, but she quickly corrected me. "Mrs. Palmer," she said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "Though I prefer Victoria." "Mrs. Palmer," I continued, "this farm has been here for nearly 100 years. We were here long before Oak Ridge Estates was even a concept. What exactly are your concerns?" She pulled out a glossy rendering from her portfolio. "This is our vision for the area," she explained, showing me an artist's conception of what looked like a manicured park with walking paths and decorative fountains. "We believe converting your western field into a community green space would significantly enhance property values in the area." I must have looked as stunned as I felt because she quickly added, "Of course, you would be compensated. Our board has prepared a very generous offer." She pulled out another document, this one showing a figure that, while substantial, was nowhere near the true value of prime farmland. "My land isn't for sale," I said firmly. "That field produces crops that feed this community. It's not going to become a walking park." Victoria's pleasant demeanor slipped for just a moment, showing a flash of something harder underneath. "Mr. Anderson, I don't think you understand. This isn't really a request. Our development plan has already been approved by certain members of the County Planning Commission. This meeting is merely a courtesy." That's when Richard Bennett, another HOA board member, emerged from the SUV parked at the end of our driveway. He approached with the same artificial friendliness as Victoria, though his demeanor had a more aggressive edge. "Jack," he said, as if we were old friends, "you have to understand that times are changing. Riverside Valley is growing. Properties, like yours, well, they're not exactly compatible with the community's new direction." I noticed Patricia Green, their legal representative, hanging back by the vehicle, watching the interaction with calculated interest. It was clear this wasn't a casual visit. It was a carefully orchestrated pressure campaign. The community? I couldn't help but laugh. Which community would that be? The one that's been here for generations, or the one you're trying to build? On top of it, Victoria's smile tightened. Mr. Anderson, perhaps you're not aware of the new municipal codes regarding agricultural operations in residential zones. Our legal team has identified several potential compliance issues with your property. That's when I noticed Emma standing on our front porch, phone in hand. From her expression, I could tell she was already calling Mike Cooper, our lawyer. Smart woman, my wife. Any existing agricultural operations are grandfathered in, I said, remembering what Commissioner Harrison had told us. Your new codes don't apply to established farms. For now, Richard Bennett cut in, his tone carrying a clear threat. But zoning laws can change. And with the right pressure from concerned citizens about noise, dust, and environmental impacts. Victoria raised a hand to silence him, but the message was clear. They weren't just here to buy my land. They were here to threaten my entire way of life. We'll give you some time to think about our offer, Victoria said, pulling a business card from her portfolio and holding it out. But don't take too long. These opportunities have a way of becoming complicated if people aren't willing to be reasonable. I didn't take the card. I think we're done here, I said, putting my work gloves back on. You can send any future communications through my lawyer. As they walked back to their SUV, I heard Victoria say to Richard, document everything, every piece of equipment in the open, every pile of materials, every fence post that might be out of code, everything. By noon, the entire valley knew about the visit. Grace Sullivan called an emergency meeting at her place. Ray Martinez came over immediately after they left, his face dark with concern. They tried the same thing with the Wilsons last week, he revealed. Frank didn't tell anyone because he didn't want to worry folks, but they're targeting all of us. That evening, as I watched the sunset paint the sky over my threatened field, I realized this wasn't just about land anymore. Victoria Palmer and her HOA weren't just trying to take a piece of my farm, they were trying to fundamentally change our way of life. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They thought they were dealing with simple farmers who would be easily intimidated by legal threats and corporate pressure. They had no idea about the strength of our community, the depth of our roots, or the fight they were about to face. The morning after Victoria Palmer's visit, I woke up before sunrise to find 3 messages on my phone. The first was from Mike Cooper, our lawyer, asking me to come to his office as soon as possible. The second was from Commissioner Harrison, warning me about an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for that evening. The third was from Grace Sullivan, simply saying, "Don't do anything until we talk." Emma could tell something was weighing on me as I got dressed. "We're not letting them. Take our land," she said firmly, handling me a cup of coffee. My grandfather didn't survive the Dust Bowl just to have his granddaughter's farm turned into a walking park. I arrived at Mike's office just as he was unlocking the door. The usually easygoing lawyer looked like he hadn't slept much. Spread across his desk were stacks of documents, property records, zoning regulations, and what looked like historical land surveys. "They've been planning this for months, Jack," he said, pointing to various papers. "These zoning change requests were filed quietly, buried in routine paperwork. They've been laying groundwork since before they broke ground on Oak Ridge Estates." Mike showed me how they'd structured their plan. The HOA had been systematically buying up small parcels of land around their development, creating a patchwork of ownership that they planned to use as leverage. My western field was just one piece of a larger puzzle. "But here's where they made their first mistake," Mike said, pulling out an old survey map. "Your great-grandfather was meticulous about in property records. The water rights to that western field are ironclad, tied to historical agricultural use. If they try to convert it to parkland, they'll lose the water rights entirely. As we discussed legal strategies, Grace Sullivan called. "Jack, you need to get to the Reed's place, now. Victoria Palmer and her crew are there with some kind of notice." I arrived at the Reed's dairy farm to find Robert Reed standing in his driveway, facing off with Victoria Palmer and Richard Bennett. 2 police cars were already there, with Officer Sarah Mitchell trying to keep the peace. Victoria was waving some official-looking document. "These cows are in violation of the new noise and odor ordinances," she was saying. "We have documented complaints from Oak Ridge Estates residents. These cows have been here for 40 years. Robert's face was red with anger. "You build your fancy houses next to a dairy farm and then complain about farm sounds and smells." Officer Mitchell stepped between them. "Mrs. Palmer, the existing agricultural operations are protected under county law. You can't retroactively apply new residential codes to established farms." Victoria's response was cold. "We'll see about that. Our lawyers are quite confident about our position." She turned to Richard. "Document everything, every sound, every smell, every violation." That's when Jenny Reed emerged from their house with their old family Bible. She opened it to reveal carefully preserved documents dating back to the 1940s. "You want documentation?" she asked, her voice steady despite her obvious anger. "Here's our original dairy license, signed by the county commissioner in 1947. Here's our water rights certificate from 1951. Here's our agricultural heritage site designation from 1995. Victoria barely glanced at the documents. "Historical documents don't override current health and safety regulations," she said dismissively. "But I could see Officer Mitchell taking photos of every page Jenny showed. The confrontation at the Reed's farm was just the beginning." Over the next week, Victoria and her HOA board members seemed to be everywhere. They showed up at Steve Thompson's place, claiming his equipment storage violated their visual aesthetic standards. They visited Frank Wilson, suggesting his historic barn wasn't up to code. They even tried to cite Ray Martinez for excessive dust during his harvest. But our community didn't take it lying down. Dr. Lisa Chen prepared a comprehensive environmental impact report showing how our farms actually improved local water quality and provided essential wildlife corridors. Tim Richards at the feed store started documenting every delivery to create a paper trail of ongoing agricultural operations. Joe Baker organized other local business owners to sign a petition supporting the farms. The tension reached a new level when Victoria Palmer tried to attend one of our regular community meetings at Grace's place. She arrived uninvited, walking into Grace's living room like she owned it, Patricia Green trailing behind her with a laptop. Grace Sullivan, all 5 feet 2 inches of her, stood up and blocked Victoria's path. "This is a private meeting in a private home," she said firmly. "You weren't invited." "As HOA president, I have a right to attend any community meetings that might affect our development," Victoria insisted. "This isn't your community," Grace replied, "and this isn't an official meeting. It's coffee with friends, unless you'd like to explain to a judge why you're trespassing in my home." Victoria left, but not before announcing that the HOA would be implementing new community standards that would affect all properties within a 2-mile radius of Oak Ridge Estates, including every farm in the valley. That evening, we gathered around my kitchen table, me, Emma, Mike Cooper, Commissioner Harrison, and Grace Sullivan. Mike spread out maps showing the HOA's proposed sphere of influence, while Commissioner Harrison explained the political realities we were facing. "They've got money and connections," David said grimly. "They've already hired one of the biggest law firms in the state, but they're making mistakes. They're too aggressive, too obvious about their intentions." Mike nodded. "They're counting on intimidation to work because it usually does. But they didn't do their homework about this community. Every threat they make, every confrontation they create, just gives us more evidence of harassment. Emma, who'd been quiet throughout the discussion, suddenly spoke up. "We need to make this public," she said. "Not just locally, nationally. This isn't just about our farm or even our valley. This is happening to rural communities all over the country." She was right. This wasn't just about a fence or a field anymore. It was about the right of agricultural communities to exist in a changing world. It was about protecting a way of life that was as vital now as it had been a century ago. "They think we're just a bunch of simple farmers they can bully into submission," I said, looking at the faces around my table. "They have no idea what they're up against." Grace smiled, that same determined smile that had seen our community through countless challenges. "Well then," she said, "I suppose it's time we show them exactly what this simple farming community can do." We spent the rest of the evening planning our response, but none of us could have predicted what Victoria Palmer would do next, or how her actions would unite our community like never before. The day after our kitchen table meeting, Grace Sullivan's living room hosted the largest gathering of farmers I'd seen since the drought of '15. Every chair was taken, people stood against. Walls and more spilled out onto her wraparound porch. The air was thick with tension and the smell of Grace's coffee. Frank Wilson sat in his usual spot by the fireplace, his weathered hands gripping his cane. At 82, he was our community's eldest voice, and when he spoke, everyone listened. "In 1962, he began, his voice carrying despite its age, developers tried to force out the Thompson family, said their cattle were a public nuisance. The whole community showed up to their hearing, every single one of us. The developers backed down because they realized they weren't fighting one farmer, they were fighting an entire community." Steve Thompson, current owner of that same farm, nodded solemnly. "My father never forgot that. Now it's our turn to stand together." Dr. Lisa Chen stood up, laptop in hand. "I've analyzed the environmental impact reports the HOA submitted to the county," she said. "They're full of inconsistencies. They claim our farms are causing water pollution, but my data shows the opposite. Our agricultural practices are actually improving water quality compared to their development." Jenny Reed raised her hand. "We've been documenting everything," she said. "Every interaction, every threat, every false claim. Robert's been taking videos of our daily operations to prove we're following all proper procedures." Mike Cooper, who'd brought 3 other lawyers from his firm, took the floor. "We're building a strong case for harassment," he explained, "but we need to be strategic. Document everything, but don't engage directly with them. Let them make the mistakes." Ray Martinez spoke up from the back. "They're not just targeting our farms," he said. "They showed up at Joe Baker's store yesterday, claiming his farm equipment parking was unsightly. They're trying to erase every trace of agricultural life from this valley." Joe Baker confirmed this with a grim nod. "They threatened to organize a boycott of any business that openly supports the farms. But they don't realize almost every business in this valley is connected to farming one way or another." Commissioner Harrison had been quiet, taking notes. Now he looked up. "The HOA has filed for an emergency zoning hearing," he revealed. "They're trying to fast-track their community standards regulations. We need every single person in this room at that hearing." Tim Richards from the feed store raised his hand. "I've been talking to farmers in other counties," he said. "This isn't isolated. These developers have a pattern. They build next to farmland, complain about agricultural operations, then use those complaints to force zoning changes." Dr. Amanda White, our veterinarian, stood next. "I've documented the health of every animal on every farm in this valley," she said. "Their claims about unsanitary conditions are completely unfounded. We can prove it." Mark Reynolds, our equipment supplier, pushed forward through the crowd. "I've got contacts at the State Agricultural Board," he offered. "They're very interested in what's happening here. This could set a precedent for other farming communities." Officer Sarah Mitchell, who'd come straight from her shift, added her perspective. "They're trying to overwhelm us with complaints," she said. "Every day, they're calling about noise, dust, equipment on roads, but they're also making mistakes. They've trespassed multiple times to take photos. We're documenting everything." Emma, who'd been quietly observing, finally spoke. "We need to think bigger," she said. "This isn't just about our farms anymore. It's about every farming community facing this kind of pressure. We need to make our story public." That's when Rachel Woods, our local reporter, stepped forward. "I can help with that," she said. "I've been collecting statements, photos, historical records. This isn't just a local dispute. It's a story about the survival of America's farming communities." Jim Brooks from the hardware store had a practical suggestion. "We need to be visible," he said. "Every farm should put up signs showing how long they've been operating, what they produce, how many local jobs they support. Make it personal, make it real." Grace Sullivan nodded approvingly. "We need to show them what community really means," she said. "Not their version with matching mailboxes and approved paint colors, but real community, the kind that's built over generations." The planning continued for hours. Everyone had something to offer. The Thompsons would host educational tours of their dairy farm. The Reeds would organize a farmers market to show the direct connection between local farms and food security. Ray Martinez would coordinate with neighboring communities facing similar pressures. Daniel Foster, head of the local farming association, worked with Dr. Chen to prepare a comprehensive report on the economic impact of our farms. "People need to understand," he said. "When you lose a farm, you don't just lose the crops or livestock. You lose generations of knowledge, specialized skills, and a way of life that can't be replaced." As the meeting wound down, Frank Wilson had one more thing to say. "Victoria Palmer and her HOA think they can divide us," he said, rising slowly to his feet. "They think we'll give in one by one, but they don't understand what makes a farming community different. We're not just neighbors. We're stewards of this land, and we stand together." The next morning, Victoria Palmer and Richard Bennett drove through our valley to find every farm displaying new signs. Wilson Family Farm, feeding this community since 1947. Reed Family Dairy, 4 generations strong. Martinez Crops, local food, local jobs. Each sign told a story. Each farm stood proud. When they tried to complain about the signs violating their community standards, Officer Mitchell was ready. "Those signs are protected under agricultural heritage laws," she informed them. "You might want to review the state statutes before filing any more complaints." But Victoria Palmer wasn't done. If anything, our show of unity seemed to make her more determined. We'd soon learn that she had one more card to play, one that would test our community's resolve like never before. Every farmer knows there are times when you have to leave your land. No matter how deep your roots go, life sometimes calls you away. For our family, that call came on a Tuesday morning in late October, when Emma's mother suffered a severe stroke in Minnesota. The news hit us hard. Barbara had always been strong, independent, the kind of woman who seemed invincible. Now she was in intensive care, and Emma needed to be there. We had no choice. We had to go, and quickly. "I'll keep an eye on everything," Ray Martinez promised as we hastily packed our bags. "Don't worry about the farm. Just take care of your family." I'd known Ray for 20 years, trusted him with my life. He knew every inch of Willow Creek Farm almost as well as I did. Still, something felt wrong about leaving, especially with Victoria Palmer and her HOA circling like vultures. Grace Sullivan came over to help us prepare for our absence. "I'll drive by twice a day," she assured us. "The whole community's on alert. That woman won't get away with anything while you're gone." Dr. Amanda White adjusted her veterinary rounds to check our livestock daily. "I'll send you videos every evening," she promised. "You'll be able to see for yourself that everything's fine." Steve Thompson offered to store our crucial documents in his fireproof safe. "Better safe than sorry," he said, helping me gather the property deeds, water rights certificates, and historical surveys. They've already tried to claim the Wilsons' paperwork was outdated. Officer Sarah Mitchell made a point of telling me she'd increased patrols around the farm. "I've got a funny feeling about that HOA president," she said. "Something about the way she was smiling at the last township meeting didn't sit right. Even Joe Baker at the general store got involved." "I've got a clear view of your western field from my upstairs window," he said. "Any unusual activity, you'll know about it immediately." The morning we left, our neighbors lined the driveway, a silent show of support and protection. Frank Wilson stood with them, leaning on his cane, giving me a solemn nod that carried the weight of generations of farmers watching over each other's land. The drive to Minnesota was tense. Every mile that separated us from the farm felt like a physical pain. Emma tried to focus on her mother's condition, but I could see her checking her phone constantly for updates from home. Ray's first update came that evening. "All quiet here. Did the evening checks. Everything secure." He attached photos of the western field, the barn, the livestock. Everything looked normal, peaceful. The next few days fell into a routine. Morning updates from Dr. White about the livestock. Midday reports from Grace about her drive-bys. Evening, check-ins from Ray about the day's operations. Commissioner Harrison even called to assure us that no new HOA proposals had been filed. But on day 5, something changed. Ray's evening message was delayed by several hours. When it came, his usual detailed report was replaced by a short text. "All fine. No problems." No photos, no specifics. I called him immediately. "Everything okay, Ray?" Yeah, he said, but his voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "Just busy with my own harvest. But don't worry, I'm keeping an eye on things." That night, I barely slept. Something felt wrong. I called Jim Brooks at the hardware store first thing in the morning. "Well," he hesitated, "I did see some suits walking around your western field yesterday afternoon. Thought they were probably county assessors. They had official-looking badges." My stomach dropped. I called Officer Mitchell. "No county assessors are scheduled for field visits this week," she confirmed. "Want me to do a detailed check?" "Please," I said, already dreading what she might find. An hour later, she called back. "Jack, you need to look at something. I'm sending you photos." The images loaded on my phone, and my blood ran cold. Victoria Palmer and Richard Bennett were in my western field, but they weren't alone. They had a survey crew with them, and a man with a camera taking photos of every fence post, every irrigation line, every piece of equipment. I called Mike Cooper immediately. He promised to send someone to investigate, but by then it was late. Afternoon. His associate called back with disturbing news. The HOA had filed an emergency petition claiming our western field was abandoned and deteriorating, presenting a hazard to the community. Grace Sullivan's call came next. "Jack, they're putting up notices along your fence line. Something about community safety concerns and pending administrative action." I felt helpless watching this unfold from hundreds of miles away. Emma was torn between her mother's bedside and the threat to our farm. Barbara's condition was stable but critical. We couldn't just leave. That's when Frank Wilson proved why he was our community's backbone. He organized a round-the-clock watch of our property. Farmers took shifts, parking their trucks at strategic points, documenting every move Victoria Palmer and her crew made. Joe Baker's teenage son used his drone to capture aerial footage of the HOA's activities. Dr. Chen began taking soil and water samples to counter any environmental claims they might make. The Thompsons positioned their cattle trailer to block the main access point to the western field, claiming it needed repairs. But Victoria Palmer had planned her move carefully. She appeared at an emergency township meeting, presenting a thick document full of evidence of abandonment and neglect. She had photos of unattended equipment, unchecked grass growth, and what she claimed were hazardous conditions. "The owners have clearly abandoned proper maintenance of this property," she told the township board. "As president of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, I am requesting emergency authorization to secure and maintain this hazardous area for community safety." Commissioner Harrison tried to intervene, but Victoria had brought Patricia Green, their legal representative, who cited obscure ordinances about property maintenance and community hazards. The township board, caught off guard by the legal jargon and apparent documentation, agreed to review the petition. That evening, our community gathered at Grace's house again, but this time I could only participate by phone. The frustration in my voice was matched by the anger in theirs. "She's trying to use your family emergency against you," Mike Cooper said. "It's despicable, but it's also a mistake. No judge is going to look kindly on someone trying to seize property while the owners are dealing with a medical crisis." But we all knew that by the time legal proceedings played out, Victoria Palmer might already have done irreparable damage to our farm. What none of us realized was that she had an even bigger plan in motion, one that would shock our entire community and force me to make the hardest decision of my life. Emma's mother's condition stabilized after 9 grueling days in the hospital. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, and Emma's sister arrived from Seattle to take over the bedside vigil. We could finally head home to Willow Creek Farm, though the knot in my stomach had grown with each passing day. The last update I'd received from Ray Martinez was troubling. "Something's happening at the western field," he'd texted. "Better get back soon." When I tried to call him for details, it went straight to voicemail. We drove through the night, taking turns at the wheel, neither of us able to shake the feeling that every minute counted. As we turned onto the familiar dirt road leading to our farm, the first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky. What we saw stopped us cold. An 8-foot-high chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire, surrounded our entire western field. Professional-looking signs were posted every 50 feet. "Community Green Space, property of Oak Ridge Estates, HOA, no trespassing." But that wasn't the worst of it. Heavy construction equipment stood silent in the morning mist. Bulldozers, graders, and concrete mixers. They'd already begun tearing up sections of our fertile farmland, replacing it with gravel paths and concrete foundations. "No," Emma whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "They couldn't have." I slammed the truck into park and jumped out, running toward the fence. That's when I saw Victoria Palmer emerging from a temporary construction office they'd set up at the edge of my field. She wore a hard hat with the Oak Ridge Estates logo, looking for all the world like she was supervising a legitimate construction project. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice carrying that same artificial pleasantness. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you back so soon." "What have you done?" My voice came out as a growl. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "Actually," she smiled, pulling out a document from her portfolio. "This area has been designated as community green space by emergency order of the township board. Your extended absence and failure to maintain the property necessitated immediate action for community safety." Richard Bennett appeared beside her, along with Patricia Green, their legal representative. "We have all the necessary paperwork," Bennett said smugly. "The emergency order gives us full authority to secure and develop this hazardous area." I was about to respond when I heard vehicles approaching. Ray Martinez's truck led a convoy of our neighbors, the Thompsons, the Reeds, Grace Sullivan, Frank Wilson being driven by his grandson, and what looked like half the farming community. "We saw your truck pass," Ray explained, his face dark with anger. "They moved in 3 days ago with the fence. When we tried to stop them, they had police escorts and court papers. Said they'd arrest us for interference." Officer Sarah Mitchell arrived moments later, lights flashing. "I came as soon as I got the call you were back," she said. "Jack, they filed the paperwork late Friday afternoon. Judge Matthews signed their emergency order without a proper review. We're already working to get it reversed, but they knew exactly when to strike," Mike Cooper finished, hurrying up from his car. "They waited until the last possible moment of your absence, used your family emergency against you, and pushed this through when most of the county offices were closing for the weekend." Dr. Lisa Chen was already documenting the environmental damage. "They've destroyed critical topsoil structure," she reported, taking samples. "The heavy equipment compaction alone will take years to repair." Joe Baker arrived with his son's drone, sending it up to capture aerial footage of the destruction. "This is criminal," he said, watching the live feed. "They've already torn up half the irrigation system." The construction foreman approached our group, looking uncomfortable. "Listen," he said quietly. "We were told this was an approved community improvement project. Showed us all kinds of official paperwork. If we'd known..." Victoria Palmer cut him off sharply. "You have your orders. This project proceeds as planned." That's when Emma, who'd been quietly taking everything in, stepped forward. "Mrs. Palmer," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "My mother nearly died. We were at her hospital bedside, and you used that family emergency to steal our land." Victoria's mask slipped for a moment, showing the cold calculation beneath. "Business is business, Mrs. Anderson. Perhaps if you people understood that, you wouldn't be in this situation." Frank Wilson spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," he said, "but I've never seen anything as despicable as taking advantage of a family crisis to steal their heritage." More neighbors were arriving by the minute. The Thompsons' teenage sons were already photographing everything from different angles. Jenny Reed was live streaming the whole scene on social media. Rachel Woods, our local reporter, was conducting rapid-fire interviews with witnesses. Commissioner Harrison arrived, looking grim. "This isn't over, Jack," he promised. "They may have found a legal loophole for temporary access, but what they're doing here goes way beyond their emergency authorization." Mike Cooper was already on his phone, calling in favors with every legal contact he had. "We'll have this emergency order reversed," he assured me, "but we need to document everything they've done in the meantime. Every blade of grass they've disturbed, every piece of equipment they've moved." Dr. Amanda White arrived with proof that the field had been actively maintained during our absence, including dated photos and videos of livestock grazing. Tim Richards had records of scheduled feed deliveries and equipment maintenance. But Victoria Palmer remained unmoved. "You can document all you want," she said. "This is now HOA property. We have invested significant resources in improving this space for community use. Any attempt to interfere will result in immediate legal action." What happened next would reshape not just our fight, but the entire future of Riverside Valley. Because Victoria Palmer had made a crucial mistake, one that would prove to be her undoing. The full extent of what Victoria Palmer and the HOA had done to our western field became clear only as the morning fog lifted. Dr. Lisa Chen walked the perimeter with me, documenting every violation, every bit of destruction they'd wrought in. "Just 3 days. The topsoil damage is extensive," she said, kneeling to take another soil sample. "They scraped away decades of carefully maintained earth to lay their gravel paths. See these compression patterns. Their heavy equipment has created hardpan layers that will take years to rehabilitate." The irrigation system my grandfather had designed and my father had perfected lay in ruins. Sections of pipe had been ripped out and tossed aside like scrap metal. The careful grading that had taken generations to perfect was destroyed by their bulldozers. Each of these sections was precisely calibrated, I explained to Rachel Woods, who was recording everything for her report. The slope, the soil composition, the water flow, it was all part of a system that took nearly a century to perfect. You can't just dig it up and expect to put it back together. Our heritage apple trees, planted by my grandfather when my father was born, had been marked with orange spray paint for removal. These weren't just any trees, they were living history, grafted from stock that had been in our family for generations. Each one produced a specific variety, some so rare they couldn't be found anywhere else in the county. Mike Cooper walked the property with his team, photographing and documenting everything. "This goes way beyond their emergency authorization," he said grimly. "They were approved to secure allegedly hazardous areas, not to begin construction of a park." The construction foreman, Pete Davidson, approached us cautiously. "I've got something you need to see," he said, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Victoria Palmer wasn't watching. He pulled out his phone, showing us the original work orders. They started planning this months ago. The emergency authorization was just an excuse. They already had all the materials ordered. Commissioner Harrison examined the documents. "These purchase orders are dated before they even filed the emergency petition," he noted. "This wasn't a response to an emergency, it was a planned takeover." Dr. Amanda White had brought her tablet, showing us the dated videos of livestock grazing in the field during our absence. "These prove the land was being actively maintained," she said. "Their claims about abandonment are completely false. The damage wasn't just physical. Victoria Palmer's actions had struck at the heart of our farming heritage. The field where my great-grandfather had first proved everyone wrong about the soil's fertility, where my grandfather had experimented with sustainable farming practices. Decades before they became popular, where my father had taught me everything I know about working with the land. It was all being erased." Steve Thompson arrived with his eldest son, who'd been studying agricultural engineering in college. They began assessing the damage to the water management system. "This isn't just about irrigation," Steve explained. "The way they've altered the drainage patterns could affect every farm downstream." The Reeds brought their soil expert, who worked alongside Dr. Chen to document the extent of the damage. "The microorganism balance in this soil took generations to develop," he explained. "You can't just scrape it away and expect to start over." Grace Sullivan had been making calls all morning. "The State Agricultural Board is sending representatives," she announced. "They're particularly interested in the heritage apple trees. Apparently, destroying designated heritage agricultural assets without proper authorization is a serious offense." Frank Wilson insisted on walking the entire property, despite his bad hip. "I remember when your grandfather put in these irrigation lines," he said, pointing to the torn-up pipes. "We all thought he was crazy, designing something so complex. Turned out he was decades ahead of his time." Ray Martinez had brought his drone operator friend, who was capturing aerial footage of the destruction. The before and after images were shocking. What had been a carefully maintained agricultural system was now a scarred landscape of gravel paths and concrete pads. "They didn't just damage the surface," Tim Richards observed, examining the torn-up ground. "They've disrupted the entire ecological system your family built. The soil structure, the water flow, the beneficial insect habitats, it's all connected." Joe Baker had been going through his store records. "I've got proof they bought materials for this project 2 months ago," he said. "They used my store's contractor account to order some of the supplies, probably thinking we wouldn't notice." Victoria Palmer appeared periodically to supervise the ongoing work, each time accompanied by Richard Bennett and Patricia Green. They seem to take particular pleasure in explaining their plans for the community green space, describing paved walkways, decorative fountains, and maintained lawns that would replace our productive farmland. "Just think," Victoria said, with her artificial smile. "Soon this eyesore will be transformed into something the whole community can enjoy. No more ugly farm equipment, no more unsightly crops, just beautiful manicured parkland." Emma, who'd been quietly documenting everything with her camera, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Palmer, do you have any idea what this land produces each year? How many families it feeds? How many local businesses depend on our crops?" Victoria's dismissive wave spoke volumes. "Progress requires change, Mrs. Anderson. Surely you can't expect us to maintain outdated agricultural operations in a modern suburban community." But her confidence was about to be shaken. Because, while we'd been assessing the damage, Officer Sarah Mitchell had been making some interesting discoveries about the emergency authorization Victoria had used to justify this destruction. "The signatures on these documents," she said quietly, pulling me aside. "Something's not right, and the timing of the filing. I think we found their weak point." Mike Cooper examined the papers carefully. "This goes beyond civil damages now," he said. "If these documents are what I think they are, we're looking at criminal charges." The community rallied around us as never before. The Thompsons offered space in their barn to store any equipment we could salvage. The Reeds arranged for emergency soil conservation measures. Dr. Chen began designing a restoration plan, though she warned it would take years to fully rehabilitate the land. But as I stood there watching Victoria Palmer smugly direct her crews to continue their destruction, I realized something important. This wasn't just about our farm anymore. This was about something much bigger, a battle between two very different visions of community, of progress, of what really matters in life. Mike Cooper's law office became our command center. The conference room walls were covered with maps, photographs, and timeline charts. Stacks of documents covered every surface, each one a piece of the puzzle we were assembling to bring Victoria Palmer and her HOA to justice. "The emergency authorization they used," Mike said, highlighting a section of the document. "Judge Matthews never actually signed it. This signature is forged." He pointed to subtle discrepancies our local forensics expert had identified. They counted on everyone being too busy to verify it during the weekend rush. Officer Sarah Mitchell was building the criminal case. "We've got multiple counts of criminal trespass, destruction of private property, forgery of official documents, and fraud," she explained, updating her report. "The DA is particularly interested in the premeditated nature of their actions. The construction foreman, Pete Davidson, had become our key witness. They told us everything was approved," he said, sharing more internal documents. "But look at these dates. They ordered materials and scheduled crews weeks before they even filed for the emergency authorization. They knew exactly what they were doing." Rachel Woods had been digging into Victoria Palmer's background. "This isn't the first time she's done this," she revealed. "I found 3 other cases in different states where she used similar tactics: small farming communities, emergency authorizations, sudden construction during owners' absences. You'd got a pattern." Commissioner Harrison arrived with news from the county level. "The township board is furious," he reported. "They've called an emergency session to revoke any authorizations related to Oak Ridge Estates, finding out they were deceived with forged documents." That didn't sit well. Dr. Lisa Chen's environmental impact report became a crucial piece of evidence. "The damage they've caused goes beyond simple property destruction," she testified. "They've disrupted an entire agricultural ecosystem. The soil compression alone violates multiple environmental protection statutes." The State Agricultural Board representatives were particularly interested in the heritage apple trees. "These varieties are irreplaceable," their expert explained. Destroying designated heritage agricultural assets without proper authorization carries severe penalties under state law. Grace Sullivan had organized the community's historical records. Every improvement, every modification to that field was documented, she said, spreading out decades of carefully preserved papers. We can prove exactly what they destroyed and what it meant to our agricultural heritage. Joe Baker's discovery about the construction materials proved crucial. They used contractor accounts at multiple businesses in different towns, he explained, trying to hide their preparations, but they left a paper trail a mile wide. The turning point came when Patricia Green, Victoria's legal representative, realized the extent of trouble she was facing. She came to my office yesterday, Mike told us, offered to turn over everything she has on Victoria Palmer's operation in exchange for consideration from the DA. According to Patricia, Victoria had been working with a network of corrupt developers across several states. They targeted farming communities, used forged documents and false emergency authorizations to seize land, and quickly converted it to community spaces that they then sold at a premium to their developments. The speed was key to their strategy, Mike explained. They'd move so fast because so much damage so quickly that by the time their actions were challenged in court, it was often too late to restore the land to its original state. Most farmers would settle for monetary compensation rather than fight a prolonged legal battle. But they hadn't counted on our community's resilience or our meticulous record-keeping. Ray Martinez had documented every interaction with them, every suspicious vehicle, every unusual activity. The Thompsons had security camera footage showing their survey crews trespassing weeks before the emergency authorization was even filed. Dr. Amanda White's daily videos of the livestock grazing proved the land was actively maintained during our absence. Tim Richards had records of regular deliveries and maintenance. Every piece of evidence contradicted their claims of abandonment and hazardous conditions. The State Police Cybercrimes Unit found something even more damning. Emails between Victoria, Palmer and Richard Bennett discussing their plans months in advance. Looking forward to adding another green space to our portfolio, one email read. These farmers never know what hit them until it's too late. Frank Wilson's testimony about the historical significance of the irrigation system caught the attention of the State Historical Preservation Office. These agricultural innovations represent important technological developments, their representative declared. Destroying them without proper review violates multiple preservation statutes. Even the construction crews turned against them. We're contractors, not criminals, Pete Davidson said, leading several workers in filing statements. We were lied to about the permits, lied to about the ownership, lied to about everything. Victoria Palmer's facade finally cracked when Mike presented her with the evidence in a preliminary hearing. Gone was the smug confidence, replaced by desperate attempts to shift blame to others. Richard Bennett turned on her almost immediately, offering to testify in exchange for leniency. The DA's office moved quickly, filing multiple criminal charges. The FBI got involved, interested in the interstate nature of their scheme. Victoria Palmer's entire operation began to unravel as similar cases in other states came to light. They picked the wrong community to mess with, Grace Sullivan said, watching Victoria Palmer being led away in handcuffs. They thought we were just simple farmers who wouldn't know how to fight back. They didn't understand that we've been protecting this land for generations. The emergency authorization was officially revoked. All construction activity was halted. But the damage to our western field remained, a stark reminder of how quickly generations of careful stewardship could be destroyed. Yet even in this dark moment, our community's strength shone through. The Thompsons offered use of their equipment for restoration. The Reeds arranged for soil rehabilitation experts. Dr. Chen began designing a recovery plan that would incorporate the the latest sustainable farming practices. It'll take time, she warned us, but with the community's help, we can restore this land. It won't be exactly the same, but we can make it productive again. Mike Cooper was already working on the civil case. The criminal charges are just the beginning, he explained. We're going after everything: damages, restoration costs, lost productivity, emotional distress. They're going to pay for every blade of grass they destroyed. The county courthouse had never seen anything quite like it. The parking lot was filled with pickup trucks and farm vehicles. Every farmer in Riverside Valley had shown up for the first day of Victoria Palmer's trial. Their presence, a silent testimony to our community's unity. Inside the courtroom, Victoria Palmer sat at the defendant's table, her designer outfit and perfect makeup a stark contrast to her fallen expression. Richard Bennett and Patricia Green sat separately with their own lawyers, having accepted plea deals in exchange for their testimony against her. The district attorney's opening statement laid out the scope of Victoria's crimes. This isn't just about trespassing or property damage, she began. This is about a calculated scheme to defraud farmers of their land, a pattern of behavior that stretches across multiple states and has destroyed countless family farms. Mike Cooper presented our case first, methodically building the timeline of Victoria's actions. The forged emergency authorization was projected on a large screen, with a forensics expert pointing out the telltale signs of falsification. Judge Matthews himself testified about never signing the document. Not only did I not sign this authorization, the judge stated firmly, but I would never have approved such a document without a proper hearing, especially concerning agricultural land with historical significance. The construction foreman, Pete Davidson, proved to be a compelling witness. They showed us what looked like legitimate papers, he testified. But when we started finding old irrigation systems and heritage trees, things didn't feel right. They kept pushing us to work faster, destroy more, said we had to make it impossible to restore. Dr. Lisa Chen's testimony about the environmental damage hit hard. Her presentation included before and after satellite images, soil samples, and detailed analysis of the destruction. This wasn't just construction, she explained. This was the deliberate destruction of a century-old agricultural ecosystem. The State Agricultural Board's representative testified about the heritage apple trees. These weren't just any trees, he said. They represented unique varieties developed over generations. Their destruction is an irreplaceable loss to our agricultural heritage. Patricia Green's testimony revealed the full scope of Victoria's operation. It was always the same pattern, she admitted. Find vulnerable farming communities, create fake emergencies, move fast enough that the damage couldn't be undone. Victoria called it modernization through destruction, said once the land was ruined for farming, no one would fight to preserve it. Richard Bennett broke down on the stand, admitting to years of participating in Victoria's schemes. She said farmers were living in the past, he testified, said we were doing them a favor by forcing them to sell, but what we did to the Anderson farm, seeing those heritage trees marked for destruction, I couldn't sleep after that. Rachel Woods presented her investigation findings, showing similar cases across 3 states. Bank records revealed millions in profits from converted farmland. Emails showed Victoria joking about backward farmers and worthless dirt being transformed into premium community spaces. Lou, the FBI agent in charge of the interstate investigation, testified about the broader criminal enterprise. Mrs. Palmer headed a sophisticated operation targeting agricultural communities, he explained. They specifically looked for farms with historical significance, believing these would be harder for owners to abandon, despite the destruction. But the most powerful testimony came from our community. Frank Wilson spoke about witnessing a century of agricultural innovation on our farm? Grace Sullivan presented the historical records showing generations of careful land stewardship. The Reeds and Thompsons testified about the impact on neighboring farms. Emma's testimony about returning from her mother's hospital bed to find our land destroyed brought many in the courtroom to tears. They didn't just damage our property, she said. They tried to erase our family's legacy while we were caring for a dying parent. Victoria Palmer's facade finally cracked during cross-examination. When confronted with email evidence of her celebrating other farmers' losses, her practiced polish fell away. "Someone has to drag these people into the modern age," she snapped. "You can't stop progress with sentiment about old trees and dirty fields." The jury took less than 3 hours to reach their verdict. Guilty on all counts: criminal trespassing, destruction of private property, fraud, forgery of official documents, conspiracy, and multiple environmental violations. The judge's sentence was equally swift. "Mrs. Palmer," he began, "your actions represent not just a crime against the Anderson family, but an attack on our agricultural heritage and the very fabric of our rural communities. The court sentences you to 5 years in federal prison, plus additional state charges to be served consecutively. The financial penalties were even more severe. Full restitution for all damage, triple damages under agricultural protection statutes, and complete liability for land restoration costs. The total came to over $2, $3 million, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore," he continued, "you are permanently barred from serving on any homeowners association board or engaging in real estate development. Your actions have demonstrated that you cannot be trusted with such responsibility." Victoria Palmer's HOA was dissolved, its assets frozen pending investigation. The development project was halted, its permits revoked. Richard Bennett and Patricia Green received lesser sentences in exchange for their cooperation, but both faced substantial fines and professional consequences. The FBI's investigation continued, targeting Victoria's network in other states. Similar cases began to surface, leading to more indictments and recoveries for other farming communities she had victimized. As we left the courthouse that day, our community gathered on the steps. Frank Wilson, supported by his grandson, spoke for many of us. "This isn't just about punishment," he said. "This is about protecting a way of life that matters, about showing that you can't just destroy generations of work and walk away." Commissioner Harrison announced new county regulations protecting agricultural heritage sites. "What happened to the Anderson farm will never happen again in this valley," he promised. "We're putting safeguards in place to protect all our farming communities." The State Agricultural Board designated our entire valley as a protected agricultural heritage zone, ensuring additional legal protections for existing farms. Dr. Chen secured grant funding for soil restoration research using our western field as a case study in agricultural recovery. But perhaps the most significant outcome wasn't legal at all. Farming communities across the country began reaching out, sharing similar stories and asking for advice. Our valley became a symbol of resistance against aggressive development, proof that rural communities could stand up to wealthy developers and win. Nature has a way of healing itself, but sometimes it needs a helping hand. The morning after Victoria Palmer's sentencing, our entire community gathered at sunrise to begin the restoration of our western field. The sight of the damage was still heartbreaking, but now there was hope in the air. Dr. Lisa Chen had developed a comprehensive restoration plan. "We're not just going to repair the damage," she explained, spreading out detailed maps on a folding table. "We're going to use this as an opportunity to implement even better, sustainable farming practices." The Thompsons brought their equipment to help remove the concrete and gravel Victoria's crews had laid down. Steve Thompson sat in his excavator for 12 straight hours that first day, carefully lifting away the foreign materials while protecting what remained of our topsoil. Ray Martinez organized the irrigation restoration team. "Your grandfather's design was ahead of its time," he said as we examined the damaged system. "We're going to rebuild it exactly as it was, but with modern materials that'll last even longer." The State Agricultural Board sent experts to help us save what remained of our heritage apple trees. Some had been damaged, but not destroyed. "These trees carry genetics that go back generations," their specialist explained. "We're taking cuttings, grafting them onto new rootstock. Your grandfather's work will live on." Frank Wilson supervised from his lawn chair, sharing stories about how the field had evolved over the decades. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," he told me, "not just of how you fought for the land, but how the whole community came together to heal it." Grace Sullivan coordinated the volunteer schedule. Farmers from across the county came to help, many bringing their own equipment. Even farmers from neighboring counties showed up, having heard about our story and wanting to be part of the restoration. The Reed family's dairy expertise proved invaluable in re-establishing proper soil biology. "Healthy soil is living soil," Jenny Reed explained as they worked their specialized equipment. "We're reintroducing the microorganisms that make this land so fertile." Joe Baker kept everyone supplied, his store becoming a hub for the restoration effort. "Never seen anything like it," he said, watching trucks come and go. People buying materials just to donate them to the project. That's real community spirit. Dr. Amanda White brought her veterinary students to help monitor the soil rehabilitation process. "The health of the land affects everything," she taught them. "This is a chance to see how agricultural ecosystems recover from trauma." Tim Richards coordinated with suppliers across the state to source exactly what we needed. "People hear your story. They want to help," he said. "Got companies offering materials at cost, some even donating outright." Commissioner Harrison used our case to push through new protections for agricultural land. "What happened here is going to help protect farms across the state," he explained. "New laws requiring agricultural impact studies before any development. Approval. Stricter penalties for fraudulent land seizures." The FBI's investigation into Victoria Palmer's network led to more discoveries. Similar cases were uncovered in other states, leading to a wave of prosecutions and new protections for farming communities. Our valley's story became a blueprint for how rural communities could fight back against predatory development. Mike Cooper helped draft new legal frameworks for protecting agricultural heritage sites. "Your case showed the gaps in existing protections," he said. "We're closing those gaps, making sure this can't happen to other farming families." Rachel Wood's reporting on our story gained national attention. Agricultural communities across the country began implementing similar protections, creating networks of support and information sharing. Our valley became a case study in rural community resilience. The construction foreman, Pete Davidson, made things right in his own way. His crew volunteered their weekends to help with the restoration, their expertise proving invaluable in removing the damage they'd been forced to create. "This is what construction should be about," Pete said. "Building things that help communities, not destroying their heritage." Officer Sarah Mitchell worked with other law enforcement agencies to develop new protocols for handling agricultural property disputes. "Your case showed us how quickly irreversible damage can happen," she explained. "We're making sure officers know how to spot fraudulent development schemes." The restoration process wasn't quick or easy. Some days were frustrating as we discovered new damage or faced setbacks. But each challenge brought our community closer together. Neighbors shared equipment, knowledge, and encouragement. Every small victory was celebrated by all. Emma started documenting the restoration process, creating a record for future generations. Our children need to know this story, she said. Not just about the fight, but about how a community can heal itself. The kids from local farms pitched in too, learning valuable lessons about land stewardship and community support. Lily and Noah worked alongside their friends, understanding in a deep way why this land meant so much to so many. As months passed, the western field began to show signs of recovery. The first crops planted in the restored soil were promising. The new irrigation system worked even better than before. Young apple trees, grafted from our heritage stock, took root where their parents had stood. A year after Victoria Palmer's sentencing, we hosted a community celebration in the restored field. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes. Children played between the new plantings, and farmers shared stories of the restoration journey. Frank Wilson raised his glass in a toast that evening. To the land, he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, to the community that protected it, and to the future generations who will learn from our story. The sun set on a gathering, painting the sky in colors that seemed to celebrate with us. The western field, though changed, was alive again. Different in some ways, but still carrying the legacy of generations of farmers who had worked this land. Our story became part of the valley's heritage, a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, that a community united can stand against any threat, that the connection between farmers and their land is something no developer's scheme can break. As I walk the western field now, I see more than just crops and irrigation lines. I see the dedication of neighbors who helped heal this land. I see the wisdom of generations who worked it before us, and I see a future where agricultural heritage is protected, where communities stand together, where the legacy of family farms lives on. Like my great-grandfather did so many years ago, I still take time each morning to listen to what the soil tells me. But now, I hear more than just the voice of the land. I hear the echoes of a community that refused to be broken, the promise of traditions preserved, and the hope of a future where the values we fought for continue to flourish. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to catch similar true stories of communities standing together. Up next, you've got 2 more incredible videos about standing up for what's right. Check them out now and join our community of viewers who care about preserving our agricultural heritage. Remember to share your own stories in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and together we can ensure that the legacy of family farms continues for generations to come.